All right, guys, let's talk about aerobic endurance training programming and technique. This one will be kind of quick just because there's a little bit of art form to it with aerobic training, but not as much as it is with resistance-based or anaerobic-based training. So we're going to discuss the factors that are related to aerobic endurance performance, select the mode, and set aerobic endurance training frequency based on training status, the sport season, and recovery requirements. Assign aerobic endurance training duration and intensity. Assign aerobic endurance exercise intensity, various methods to monitor that intensity, and describe the various types of aerobic programs that you could do. Apply the program design variables and address cross-training, detraining, tapering, supplemental resistance training when designing an aerobic program. So, give me a second, my dog is kind of go away, go. There you go. So, maximal aerobic capacity is as the duration of an aerobic endurance event increases, so does the proportion of total energy that must be met by aerobic metabolism. Think about bioenergetics at that point. Why do you think it takes so long for us to get to a certain point where we are producing as much ATP, even when we're utilizing a glucose-based source? And why it takes us so long to get to that point where fat becomes, one of our main fuel sources? Well, the reason all that starts to occur is because now we have to start meeting that metabolic demand as well. And so that's the only way we can do it. There's a high correlation between VO2 max and performance in aerobic endurance events. That is true. I mean, if you have a high VO2, odds are you're going to be pretty good at endurance-based events. But another thing that we're going to talk about in this chapter is just because someone doesn't have necessarily a high VO2 or their VO2 might not match that of other participants maybe on their team, for instance, maybe on a cross-country team. Just because someone has a lower VO2 max doesn't mean that they're going to be worse at the event. There could be the possibility that their lactate threshold may be higher than someone else's. And if that's the case, then that means that they're going to be able to work at a higher intensity. So it kind of makes up for that lack of VO2 aspect. So just like I started to mention already, the lactate threshold is the speed of movement or a percentage of the VO2 max at which a specific blood lactate concentration is observed, or the point at which blood lactate concentration begins to increase above resting levels. So if you remember ex-phys and any of that type stuff, or even when we started talking a little bit of bioenergetics, what we saw is that blood lactate, as intensity increases, it starts to increase, and it's pretty level for the most part. But if we ever get to that point where we're becoming too anaerobic in nature, what's going to happen is that lactate starts to build up because we're not able to clear it as often. Well, as soon as we hit that point, everybody typically is between that 45 to 65%, or 40 to 60% of your VO2 max is when we start to see that occur. But really, once we start pushing it past that, it really starts to spill over, and that graph of lactate just shoots up, meaning that we're not going to be able to maintain that intensity for much longer. And so give me 1 second, guys. I'm going to pause this for just a second, and I'm back. So once that lactate starts to shoot up, we get into a point where we become more anaerobic. And as you become more anaerobic, the ability to maintain that decreases heavily. So if you have a lower VO2 max, but maybe a higher lactate threshold, which we can train the lactate threshold, you may be able to make up for that lack of your VO2. Several studies have shown that an athlete's lactate threshold appears to be an indicator of his or her aerobic performance. It can be, because if I'm able to push myself to, let's even just put it this way. Let's say we both have a VO2 of 50. I'm going to use low numbers and easy numbers here, okay? And let's just say person A, their lactate threshold sits at 50%, okay? So if they start to go at 51% or even really at 50, they run the risk of becoming anaerobic and fatiguing faster. But let's say person B, let's say their lactate threshold is at 60%. Well, that means that I can work, if I'm person B, at an intensity that's almost, 58%. I'm 8% higher than you as person A. So we can have that as an indicator. We can also look at some of the stuff that's related to performance. Exercise economy. Measure the energy cost of activity at a given exercise velocity. So in other words, are you economic with your movement? Meaning, are you as efficient as possible? Because if you're not efficient, then you are going to be wasting more energy because you're doing things that are, I guess, technically not needed. There's a good Friends episode, if any of you watch Friends, or I don't know, sometimes this example falls flat, but go back and even if you look it up on YouTube, look at Phoebe, Phoebe, running in Friends. And the way she runs, she's technically running, so what's the problem? Well, if you watch what she does, she flails her arms, her legs are going everywhere. So she's utilizing a lot more energy to run than someone who is more runs with proper technique. If you can improve that economy or that technique or that efficiency, sometimes that maximal aerobic power, that VO2 max, and lactate threshold can be improved just through technique. So we can maybe start with how long is your stride? How is your stride? Different types of things. So sometimes with aerobic performance, technique is the first thing we need to fix, and then we can work on everything else. So how do we design an aerobic program? First off, you got to figure out the mode. What's your mode of aerobic endurance that you want to do? If it's something that's specific to an athlete, if they're a runner, the base of your program needs to be running. I mean, I think we could all agree on that. If they're a cyclist, cycling, swimmer, swimming. But just because they are a runner or a cyclist or a swimmer doesn't mean that their whole program has to be in that one specific mode. We can utilize, because of the fact that cycling is actually less muscle damage inducing, right? I mean, it really is. There's a lot of less muscle damage that goes on in cycling than in running. Maybe we utilize cycling 1 to 2 times a week or every now and then to give the runner a little bit of break. We have less joint issues on cycling, right? There's not as much pounding. So maybe it's a way to maintain some fitness, right? Maintain training, but we're giving them a break. Or how many of you have ever, not swimming like, oh, I'm going out to the pool today, like actually done a swimming workout? If you do an actual swimming workout where you do the butterfly, the free stroke, even backstroke, all that, it burns a lot of calories. But guess what? And it'll burn those muscles apart in a good way, but your joints don't feel it at all. You're weightless in a sense. So it's a way to almost give somebody a break here, right, and in the body, but in reality, on fitness breaks, we're not giving them a break. You just need to make sure that, for one, you don't put it into a too often, in the sense where you're losing a lot of the benefits that can come from their specific sport activity, and making sure that you're not thinking that whatever I do on a bike, I can do as a runner, I can do in the pool. I can tell you now that I could probably ride the bike for quite a while. I'm not a big runner. I really don't. I don't run a lot, but swimming I'm okay at, real true swimming. So um, I can do a lot more and handle a lot more maybe on the bike and swimming than I would if you told me to go run. And vice versa. There's going to be people that go and run, 10 miles a day that might be able to cycle a little bit, but you put them in a pool, they don't have the muscle mass essentially to um, withstand it maybe. So just be cognizant of who your person is and what you're putting through them in the program. What about training frequency? So here's a big deal, because when you go in and we start to look at the differences between aerobic or endurance versus um, anaerobic and resistance training, I have the ability to train upper body on Monday and then lower body on Tuesday and go pretty hard with both, and I can fill up the week a little bit more. Well, with aerobic training, that's a lot of pounding, and you really only have, even if you go and you are walking, you're using the same joints as you would if you're running, right? So you got to understand that you're basically limited to a certain subset of muscles or parts of the body. That's why if you're going to go with more days, it may be beneficial to add in like cycling or swimming, because you're able to get that fitness in, but you're giving them a break and you're not pounding the body into the ground. Number of training sessions per week, it all depends. A lot of it depends on training status and the duration of it, the training status of the athlete in the specific sports season. And at the same time, you're going to build. And you got to understand that with, we can do the same stuff in a resistance training program. I can change what phase I'm in. Am I in a strength? Am I in power? Am I in hypertrophy? Whatever it might be. And I can get everything into an hour. I can program that. But let's think about it this way. If I'm practicing to train for a marathon and I'm not a big runner, right? Marathon is 26.2 miles. So when I'm at the very beginning of my training, the amount of time, first off, that it might take me, if you told me to start with, this week I want you to run 1 mile a day, okay? Let's just say my mile time is 10 minutes, okay? Do you think I'm going to run 10 minutes, first off, that same pace when I move to 2 miles or 3 miles, 4, 5? You get what I'm saying? And if you tell me all I have is 1 hour, well, I'm sorry. The world record for a marathon is like at 2 hours. So if you only have an hour to train, aerobic and endurance-based programs like this, you have to be understanding that as we progress, time during each session is going to have to increase more than likely. Training intensity, you need to be able to, obviously the training session is specific and the intensity is going to dictate what's happening. High intensity aerobic exercise increases that cardiovascular and respiratory function and allows for improved oxygen delivery to those working muscles. So yes, the more intense that we can be, the more beneficial we'll be. And with aerobic endurance exercise, that's not necessarily meaning, oh, we got to bump it up to 90, 95% like we would possibly for resistance training. Because if you're at that percentage in aerobic, well, I'm sorry, that's no longer aerobic. 95% of my VO2 max is essentially a sprint. Okay. But you need to be increasing that intensity because they will adapt just like we do in resistance training. And at a certain point, what used to be my 50% of my VO2 max, if I've improved my VO2 max, that 50% changes now, right? Or I've made adaptations and I'm getting used to what's going on. So let's bump it up to 55%. Okay. We still need to make jumps and increases. So one of the ways we can do that is through a heart rate, the most frequently used method. And the reason we use this method is because unless you have access to stuff like that's in the lab over in our offices where we can hook the mask up to you and you have all that, how are you going to obtain their VO2 max? You can do an estimated VO2 max with their heart rate, or at least utilizing heart rate as a percentage aspect for intensity. So if we look at it, if we look at the relationship between your VO2 max, your heart rate reserve, and your maximal heart rate, you can look at it about like this. If you're looking at something where you're prescribing a 50% of your VO2 max, they need to be roughly 66% of their max heart rate. Okay. And you just follow this chart and you do it like this in a sense where, because once again, even if we did, let's say we knew and you had all the ability to look at the equipment and you could get a true VO2. Well, here's the deal. You may have that and that's great. But if you start telling me that for my program on Tuesday, I need to be at 60% of my VO2 max. Okay, well, care to explain a little more, right? So even when you're doing your programs, you need to put on there a percentage of the VO2 max that you're trying to train at. But when you're telling somebody, it would be just the same way as somebody saying, we're doing 50% of your 1 rep max. So go ahead and put 100 pounds on the bar. Okay, that makes sense. So put on there, hey, I need you to be at 55% of your VO2 max. So to make sure you're there, I need you to stay at right about 70% of your max heart rate. Because guess what? It's pretty cheap to buy a heart rate monitor, right? Most people have Apple Watches, whatever it might be. A heart rate monitor is a lot cheaper than any of the other alternatives. So how do we get those target heart rate calculations? One way is we can use the Carvona method. So you take your age predicted max heart rate, which is just 220 minus your age. We have heart rate reserve. We have that age predicted minus your resting heart rate. The target heart rate, so whatever that heart rate reserve is, okay, times the exercise intensity. So times 0.7 for 70%, plus that resting heart rate. Do this calculation twice to determine the heart rate range. Another way to do it, I've told y'all that you want to be very specific in resistance training to percentages because it makes a big difference with the number of repetitions that you do. But here with aerobic endurance, I'm going to go back a slide real quick. It's actually okay to give a range. So it might be where, hey, today I need you to be between 55 and 60%, which is 70 to 70, let's just round it up, 75%. You think about it, that at least gives them a window to where if maybe they reach a little bit of a hill or something that might change their intensity, they don't think that they're doing something wrong because your heart rate kind of fluctuates a little bit. So making sure that you give them a range, but make sure that when you give them that range, you need to tell them, I don't want you going lower than 140 beats, but I don't want you going any higher than 160 beats. Okay, whatever it might be, obviously try not to use such a large gap, but just for example, okay? Those target heart rate calculations, again, you can use the percentage of the max heart rate. So once again, you take 220 minus your age times the intensity. You just need to do it twice to determine what that target heart rate is that you want them to hit. You can also use something like a ratings of perceived exertion scale. I did this. That was one of the big ways my trainer did it for me when I trained for my triathlon, is that, sometimes that intensity, it's hard to understand, and plus it might be something where today is just not my day. Okay. So today, if you told me to work at a 8 on a scale, you need to tell me what the scale is first off. It might be that you say on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being sitting on your couch, 10 being the fastest, the hardest thing you've ever done in your life. Okay. If you tell me today that I need to work at a 7, well, guess what? If I'm having a rough day or I'm sluggish, whatever it might be, the benefit of using that type of a scale for intensity is that, again, my 7 for my day-to-day may change, but I'm still going to be working at what I perceive to be a 7. So I'm not going to sit there and, sit there and not get what I need out of it. It might not be what you expected today, but at least it's me working at the same intensity that you're asking me to work at, no matter what my feeling or my ability is that day. And like I said, this is just a simple 1 to 10. You can make it whatever you want it to be. I mean, the Borg scale is, I believe, 6 to 22. It's very weird, but it can be whatever you want it to be. You can be, hey, I want you to work from between a 1 and a 5, 5 being the maximum effort, can't go any further, right? So it's going to be a little different, but you want it to be where whatever you do, if you do give this as a way as your training intensity, make sure that you share this with your person. Okay, that way they understand what that means. And it might be that you need to put a little bit more explanation behind it. It could be that a 3 put out there, for example, walking. 10, all out sprint. 7, nice, easy jog, or, a vigorous jog, whatever it might be. You just need to make sure that whatever you're doing, that the person, when they look at it and they read your program, they can follow it and have as minimal questions as possible. So how else do we do it? We can do it through METs. 1 MET is equal to 3.5 milliliters per kg per minute of oxygen consumption. It's considered the amount of oxygen required by the body at rest. So if you have their VO2 and you want it to be at 50%, let's say it's a 50 VO2, so that's 25 milliliters per kg per minute. That is what? Roughly 5 METs, on a little bit more, maybe 6 METs on the high end. And that might be something where if they're training on a treadmill or something like that, METs is typically one of those measurements that's on a treadmill or piece of equipment. Power measurement, cyclists may use power measuring cranks and hubs to regulate intensity. So again, if you're doing that with the resistance on the flywheel, so you might need to sit there and tell them on, as far as they may be better off with the RPEs, right? I need you to get to a resistance that's about a 7. Okay, that's fine. You're not caring about the heart rate in a sense, okay? Exercise duration, it's the length of the time of the training session. I think we all know that, but just understanding that, if you have an hour with the person, I mean, obviously if somebody is training for something very specific, your number one hope is that they are carving out time and they have the understanding of what that is going to be required of them. But if there's somebody that just has 1 hour a day or something, maybe it is something where you can go and do more and be more proactive with cycling or swimming, stuff like that, because then it's a little bit more, how long it's going to take. You can tell them how long to to cycle for, at what intensities, or how how far they need to swim and what rest period. You can do the same with running. It's the fact that as you start to build miles on with running, it takes longer and longer. Okay. The higher the intensity, the shorter it's going to be. The lower the intensity, the longer it should be. Pretty simple. Exercise progression. Progression of the program involves increasing everything, just like it does with the resistance training program. So your intensity should not increase by more than 10% a week. So don't go from 50% heart rate to 70% next week. You at the high end, you need to go from 50 to 60, 60 to 70, for example. When it's not feasible to increase the frequency or duration, progression can occur with intensity manipulation. So once again, if you're time crunched, maybe you need to do something with the intensity. Change up the intensity or how they're doing it for that time period or those 3 days a week, whatever it might be. But you need to monitor it just like you would in the weight room, because this is one, and I think that more people are like this with running and stuff like that. They get a little overboard, and honestly, they actually overtrain, and that's why they don't see any type of improvement in what they're doing aerobically. So be very careful and cognizant of what you're doing, or making sure you understand what the person actually is doing outside of their time with you. This one just kind of gives you a little bit of a training type that you're doing and how many times you need to do it. You obviously need to, with timing, it needs to be race related sometimes. For long, slow distances, they typically don't need to go more than 1 to 2 times a week, just because it's a lot of volume and it's a lot of time. If you're working at race or pace tempo, you need to be at their lactate threshold or at or slightly above that race pace, just for adaptation reasons. And then you just go down and you look at it, and you can change based on what you're doing. So you can sit there and put, let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can put 1 for each day of the week if you needed to, right? Because it's all different types of intensities. So when we look at the types, long, slow distance, you need to train at race distance or greater, or 30 minutes to 2 hours, pretty much. I mean, and I say 2 hours because if you're sitting there and you're trying to run a marathon, if you're just a normal average person running a marathon, I hate to break it to you, you're not going to train and get into 2 hours in your first one. You're probably looking at about a 3 to 3.5 hour race. So that 2 hours kind of doesn't apply there. But if you're looking at somebody that is highly trained and they're doing that type of stuff, then that needs to be their max time. I mean, you're trying to train at world record type of paces in a sense. But at the same time, if a marathon is 26.2 miles, whoever I'm training, they need to be able to go further than that. Like, we need to train and do like 30, 35-mile runs. And you're thinking, why? Well, would you rather be able to be good and maintain a certain pace from start to finish? Or would you rather your person be getting to the, mile 25 and they're hitting that struggle bus, and then now they're falling back in the back of the pack? So we always want to go a little further than what we're going to actually perform at. Intensity is equivalent to about that 70% of that VO2 max. I mean, you need to be sitting there and be consistent with it. Be able to adapt. Can they run at 70%? Maybe they can only run at that for 30 minutes. All right, that's fine. Next week, we're going to run at that intensity for 35 minutes. So you keep pushing them time-wise to be able to maintain a certain intensity. That way, pace remains the same. Adaptations from this exercise include enhances the body to clear lactate which is what we want. And it causes an eventual shift. Doesn't shift your fiber types. What it does is that it will actually start to increase the efficiency of those type 1s. And then what starts to happen is those type 2As, those that kind of are a mixture, start to resemble more type 1, but there's never a true fiber type shifting. The intensity is lower than that of competition, which may be a disadvantage if too much long, slow distance training is used. You need to train at race pace, or try to. Why? Because you don't want to sit there and go for leisurely strolls and then now all of a sudden we're at race day and now it's like, okay, I need to kick it into another gear. No, we should have been already kicking it into that gear during training at some point. Pace and tempo training, intensity at or slightly above that competition intensity, corresponding to their lactate threshold. Steady pace, tempo training, 20 to 30 minutes of continuous training at that lactate threshold. So if your lactate threshold is at 65% of your VO2, we need to train at 65% for a continuous 20 to 30 minutes. Intermittent pace tempo training, series of shorter intervals with brief recovery periods. Basically develop a sense of race pace and enhance the body's ability to sustain exercise at that pace. And it helps improve that running economy too, because if you know what it feels like to run at your race pace, then you can make improvements. And then what starts to happen is that 65% feels a lot easier the more you do it. Interval training, exercise at an intensity close to your VO2 max for 3 to 5 minutes. So if you were to work at 5 minutes at that intensity, you need to rest for 5 minutes. Basically what it is. And then you can redo it. This allows the athlete to train at intensities close to that VO2 max, increases your VO2 max, and enhances that anaerobic metabolism. I would even say that sometimes our long endurance athletes need this as well, because first off, what do you do at the very beginning of the race? You're pretty anaerobic to begin with, so you need to be able to weather that storm. And let's just say something happens during the race and we come down to that last mile or whatever it might be, and they need to really kick it into another gear because they're trying to beat somebody else. This would be beneficial to them to help them know what that feels like, and it helps with the body basically to be able to shift back into that gear and be able to maintain that intensity for that final push. HIIT training uses repeated high-intensity bouts interspersed with brief recovery periods. You need to spend several minutes, though, at above 90% for it to be optimal. It may be effective for improving your running economy and running speed. So once again, just because they're an endurance athlete doesn't mean that they can't utilize these higher intensity types of work to improve other aspects of their entire performance. Long interval HIIT is 2 to 3 minutes at 90% of that VO2 max with about 2 minutes of rest. So once again, you're kind of working at that 1-to-1 ratio. Fartlek training combines other methods of training. Easy running combined with hills or shorts, fast bursts can be adapted for cycling and swimming. It can help with VO2 max enhancement, increase lactate threshold, and improve that running economy and that fuel utilization. Again, it's also one of those things where if you've ever done any type of endurance-based training, if you sit there and tell somebody, and there's always those special cases of people that enjoy it, but if you're going out and running 15 miles every day or whatever it is, eventually it gets boring, or that you would like maybe a change of scenery. And so changing up the style of training, even if they're typically out there for an hour and a half, and now you've moved them in. You know what? Today we're doing HIIT training for 30 minutes or whatever it might, 45 minutes. Okay. Well, guess what? It's just a change of scenery. It gets them, it kind of keeps them fresh in a sense. It changes things up to where it's not just monotonous and the same thing over and over and over. So if we look at it, designing to the training seasons, off season, it's really your base training. So begin with long duration and low intensity and gradually increase intensity and to a lesser extent that duration. Preseason, focus on increasing the intensity, maintaining or reducing duration, and incorporating all types of that training. Again, you're trying to keep people somewhat fresh. In season, the program should be designed around a competition, mainly low intensity and short duration training just before your race days. So you don't want to go and have somebody, the day before the race and go and put them through the ringer. You're probably ending your training and doing just light work 2 to 3 days ahead of time. And also, this is where in season, it may be beneficial to kind of get them onto the bike, onto into the pool a little bit, reducing some of the stress and strain that we put on the joints during normal stuff. And then it gears towards when you're on there, if they're a runner, their running needs to be geared more towards whatever they're going to be competing in. And then postseason, that active rest, focus on recovering from the competitive season while maintaining sufficient fitness. So once again, this is where we can start to really add in maybe the cycle or the pool for runners because it allows for them to kind of let those joints, let the lower body recover, but yet we're still maintaining a good level of fitness as well. Basically, it needs to be divided into your sports season. Your entire year needs to incorporate everything. You need to be well-rounded. That's the big key right there. So special issues, because you don't always have somebody that's just purely one thing and nothing else. If we're looking at cross training, it's a mode of training that can be used to maintain general conditioning in athletes during periods of reduced training due to injury or during recovery from a training cycle. So you can put in some, if they're a resistance trainer, they can go in and work aerobically to maintain a little bit of fitness or, again, reducing the strain and stress that we put on a body, but maintaining some form of movement. Detraining occurs when the athlete reduces the training duration or that intensity or stops training altogether due to a break. And what we'll see is even if somebody gets sick, they come back a week later, their training or their training status, it's altered. And you just have to make sure that, okay, we may not be able to start where we wanted to originally. We have to take it back a couple steps. Good thing is as long as that duration is not for a super prolonged time, the adaptations will occur faster and you're able to jump up and get closer to where you were originally wanting to go a lot sooner. Tapering. So the big thing with tapering is it's a systematic reduction in that training duration, and it's an intensity combined with an increased emphasis on technique and nutritional intervention. The objective here is to attain peak performance at the time of competition. So again, you're not trying to do all your training up until the day before. You've hit a certain point and then you kind of steadily decrease it. You're tapering down. That way the body's inherently trying to get recovered. So when we do hit race day, we're at 100% and we still have all that fitness that we've maintained over that amount of time. Resistance training, research is limited, but I will tell you this. If you're wanting to be faster, if you're wanting to have better endurance, we can work with starting to make the muscles in the legs or wherever it is that you're doing bigger or stronger. And then we'll put that towards the goals of your training. It's going to improve that short-term exercise performance. You may recover faster. from certain injuries, prevention of overuse and muscular imbalances. And it can improve any types of hill climbing, bridging gaps between competitors during the breakaways, and that final sprint. That's where this will help. Just know that if you're resistance training and aerobically trained at the same time, odds are your muscular gains or strength gains are not going to be as beneficial. You're going to need to do resistance training kind of as a forefront if that's what you're looking for. And then training at altitude, the height above sea level, okay? It typically, acclimatization occurs 12 to 14 days at moderate altitudes, but can take up to several months. So this is why it was basically the Mexico City Games in the 50s for the Olympics. They went from Japan in the previous Olympics to Mexico City. So Japan, it's an island, so it's at sea level. Mexico City is actually at altitude. I believe it's higher than Denver. So what would happen is that we started to see performance decrease because we didn't know any different. But it was those games that kind of shifted the research area and the training aspects of aerobic endurance. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that if we can, we get the athletes to where they're trying to go maybe 2 weeks beforehand, let them acclimatize to that position and train in that situation and environment to make sure that at competition time, it's not hitting us all at once. Also, you can, you need a hypoxic dose of 12 hours a day for a minimum of 3 weeks at a moderate altitude. So again, unless you're doing like a hyperbaric chamber or whatnot, you need to go at the actual altitude or at that environment to get to see the training. That's why also one of our big training places is in Colorado. We get all the benefits of that aspect. So when we do hit down to a sea level, we're actually better at what we're going to be performing at than what we would be if we trained at sea level and then went up to altitude. So that's aerobic endurance training. Like I said, it's a little easier in a sense because you're able to use ranges. You have a lot more fluidity with the style or the mode that you're using. But hopefully this helps. Hopefully you get what you need out of it for your programming. And if you have any questions, guys, please do not, wait. Email me and we can set up a Zoom. We can do whatever we need to do. All right. All right. Have a good time and stay safe out there with everything that's going on. Have a good one.